This room, I don't know, I feel weird about this. At least we're a big version of the behavior class. I've taught this class with like 7 or 8 people in it before, so we're more than twice that. This room is probably too big for us, but in any case, I think it'll work a little better. It's a little less cramped. I felt like we were kind of like climbing on top of each other in the other room. Plus, it was crazy freaking loud all the time. I know who's missing Morgan because she's at an athletic thing. That's why. Okay, so what we're doing is we're just going to pick up where we left off, though. I think this room will work for us. And we need to finish off the Chapter 2 lecture, and just looking at it, somehow there's quite a bit more to do. So that'll be, take the first half of class, I'm sure. And then what I want to do after that is launch into doing the Chapter 2 homework discussion and talking about those questions. For lab today, as I said, we had to cancel in it. I don't know, I was just walking in today, and it's freaking beautiful outside. So we'll see, but the forecast I saw still said that we could get hit with thunderstorms at 1:30 as of this morning. So I kind of want us to get hit by thunderstorms because we canceled the field trip, or at least pushed it back. So the plan is we're going to do the field trip next week, and that lab therefore will have to be pushed till next week. So we are instead doing a in-class lab, or in-lab lab, and the lab still meets in the aquatics lab. We're not going to be here. We're going to be back in the aquatics lab for lab time. And we're going to be doing a session on a mesquite software and phylogenies, which I think does bridge pretty nicely into some of the stuff we've been doing in lecture also. So the timing is actually pretty good for that. So you will need to have your laptops with you. I do want everybody to get a chance to play with this software. It's a research grade software, but it's reasonably user friendly, and it's graphic user interface and all that jazz. And if possible, I'm going to ask you download it and install it. And so if you go onto Canvas and go into the lab site and look for the Mesquite tutorial, there are instructions on how to download this software and install it. If you can at least have it downloaded, that's great. If you can't figure like the installation, you have to extract a zip file and stuff. It's not super hard, but if you haven't done that before, I can help you with that when we actually get to lab. But it will save us a little bit of time if you're not sitting there twiddling your thumbs waiting for the file to download. Okay, and then next week what I'd like to do is we'll do a quiz on Chapter 1. So all of Chapter 1, that means the lecture and the homework. That doesn't mean if there's anything that's in the chapter that we didn't talk about and like either the lecture or the homework, I'm not going to go like trying to find things that we didn't cover and get you on them. But I do want you to be ready to talk about anything that we talked about on the homework or in lecture. You may need to apply those concepts to new situations. That's not uncommon for this kind of class. And anything from Chapter 2, I think anything from Chapter 2 lecture also would be fair game for the quiz. I don't know the format yet. It usually sort of depends on how it goes as I'm writing it. Usually it's some combination of multiple choice and short answer questions. And short answer, I'm talking a sentence or two usually. Okay, as opposed to like a half a page essay. You shouldn't have to be doing that too often. And then we should start in Chapter 3 after that, which is focused on development and genetic control of behavior. Any questions? We all right? All right. Well, good. So this is, I think, where we left off, is we were just starting to talk about evolutionary history of song learning. We mentioned that there's these 3 groups of birds that do have the ability to learn song. Those are the hummingbirds, the parrots, and the passerine songbirds, or in your book is calling them the Oscine songbirds, which is a new term to me, but I think is more correct than passerines. Passerines is a little bit too inclusive, I guess. I guess all of these are the Oscines and sub-Oscines are all the passerines. This doesn't maybe mean anything to you if you haven't had a lot of ornithology, but if you have, this is where a lot of the songbirds live. But these guys, these sub-Oscines, are apparently one group of that. But like I said, that's kind of new to me. But in any case, we talked about trying to figure out what's the possible evolutionary history of song learning then. So when do we think song learning evolved? And this is actually really nice. I can do this. Just so I can write on the picture. I have to go up. Stop. Right there. Okay. So there's a couple possibilities. One is, I think we mentioned, song learning could have evolved like right here. So I guess I should make that like a plus. So if we had it evolve at the very base of the thing, and then would basically have to get lost in a bunch of different lineages. So it would have to be lost in this lineage. It would have to be lost in this lineage, I think, for this to work. And then kind of has to be retained in all these ancestors, right, for it to be inherited up to here. So it would have to be lost here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And then also here. But that is one way it could have happened. I mean, that's not an impossible thing to have happened. But, you know, if it only evolved once, it would have to be lost a whole bunch of times for this thing to work. In contrast, I think another scenario we talked about is that maybe it evolved 3 separate times. So it could have evolved right here. It could have evolved here, and it could have evolved here all 3 times independently. Did you see any other possibilities? I can't remember if we had any others. I think there are others. Those are kind of the 2 extremes. 3 separate evolutionary events where it was where it evolved, or 1 time that it appeared and then was lost a whole bunch of times after that. What else could have happened? Do you have any ideas? Just looking at this. What do you think?
It could have evolved on the line right below parrots and
right there?
Right there, and then independently evolved with hummingbirds.
Okay, so
and then been lost in the sub.
yeah. So if it evolved right here, you have to ignore my other colors now. If it evolved right there at the base of parrots and Aucian songbirds and the sub-Aucians, like this whole group, then it would be retained for parrots, retained for the Aucian songbirds, and then I guess, yeah, it would need to get lost for the sub-Aucians. But that could be like one package. And then over here, it would just have to be, I think, just like total separate evolutionary event, right? Does that make sense? So I think that's another plausible way that this could have happened. So the idea is that the ancestor of all these birds did not have song learning, but that it basically evolved twice. Hummingbirds and this ancestor of parrots and all of these guys, and then it got lost in these sub-Aucians. Is that okay? So we have 3 different scenarios here, and we could try to stare at these things and try to discern, right, which ones of these do we think are the most likely? And there are some ways in which we can maybe identify this. I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on what is the most likely, or how could we tell what's the most likely? Just with these data, we probably can't know for sure, but I think we could at least sort of put some likelihood estimates on these things. What do you think? Are there one of those 3 that you like the best? Or 2 of those 3 that you like the best? One that you hate? I don't know. The red one? Why do you like that one more than the others?
Because looking at the different species of birds, like hummingbirds and parrots, live in totally different environments. So, for that to develop, it would kind of make sense that like evolve separately in each species.
I'm not writing this out well on the board here. I said something like, so all 3 of these groups are very different and live in different environments, and therefore it does kind of make sense that they might each have their own little pathway. But I think that's their own evolutionary history. Other ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say that the blue pathway is probably the least likely of all of them because it requires so much genetic change to happen.
Yeah, so there's like a gazillion things that have to happen for that one to work. So So the one origin you only have to have one origin, so that's kind of nice. And if you think this property of being able to learn song, maybe that's an incredibly difficult thing to have evolve and would not be likely to repeat itself, then maybe you make that argument. But you have to have one origin, but that you also have to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different losses, and you would have to therefore explain why would it be lost then in 8 different lineages. So there is a system. This is kind of hinting at a thing we'll be talking about this afternoon, which is this idea of parsimony, which is also sometimes described as like Occam's razor, this idea that the simplest answer is the most likely to be correct. Doesn't mean it is correct, it just means it's more likely to be correct. So we might argue that if you go up here and just, simple-headedly just count how many different evolutionary events there are, the one origin one has a lot of events that have to happen. Whereas the three separate independent evolutionary origins one, that's 1, 2, 3 things that has to happen. If you weight each thing equally, then that's only 3 versus, what was it, 9 for the other one? And similarly, this green one, where you have 2 origins and then a loss, that's also 3 events. So maybe you argue that those 2 are roughly equally likely, the green and the red, but this blue one maybe is not so useful for us. That'd be one way to think about it, or one way to argue about it. So parsimony, again, argue simpler is more likely. And we'll be using that idea this afternoon when we're trying to do similar kinds of things using the software and also not. So when I'm looking at these, I'm going to put the screen down again. I mean, I would argue both the 3 origins and then the 2 origins ones are probably equally likely. My bias is often just a little, and this is just my bias, and there are lots of people who disagree with me in the profession. My bias is that origins are probably harder to have happen than losses. So I'm a little biased towards the 2 origin explanation versus the 3, but certainly there's legitimate reason to think that it evolved more than one time. So probably in hummingbirds, and then either in the ancestor of parrots and songbirds, or maybe independently in parrots and in songbirds. But it is still possible that it evolved once and was lost numerous times. We do see, I think, kind of in keeping with this idea that there is this chance that it does have sort of a common origin, or at least a lot of parallelisms that are going on. We do see a lot of similarities across the different groups. So for example, all 3 groups that do song learning use this Ch2 gene, which appeared on your homework. But the Ch2 gene is used in all 3 of these groups, and it's prominently used. In fact, it's used so much in all these song learning structures that you can use it as kind of like a marker for a song learning structure. So you can stain for zinc, the protein, and then use that as an indication of what parts of the brain are involved in song learning or song production. And when you do that, not only do you see that zinc is used in all 3 different groups, but it's even used in similar kinds of regions. So for example, this is kind of like a schematic brain of a hummingbird, a parrot, and a passerine songbird. And what you can see is that all of them have kind of like, they have this NCM area. This is the caudoneostriatum, and that seems to be heavily involved. It expresses zinc in all 3 birds when they are listening to or trying to produce song. And you see other kinds of similarities as well. There's some higher vocal centers. Maybe there's a little bit more similarity in the parrots and passerine songbirds, at least to my eye. And sometimes they have different names, and I kind of wonder if they just named the same thing, different things in these different cases. They're mostly anatomical names. They all have these same sort of control mechanisms for the syrinx down here. And so I think there's at least some indication that there's some commonalities. But could that be because they share exactly the same origin, or could it be because their ancestor had some of these same machinery and then they've been co-opted for different reasons? Or they co-opted for the same reason in all 3 groups independently, and all these things are possible. So, you know, the answer, unfortunately, to me is a little bit unsatisfying. And that's the way life is sometimes, where there's not a sort of uniform, agreed upon, universal decision about the origin of song learning. But I think at the minimum, I think it's very likely that we probably have multiple evolutionary events. But that's where I'm going to leave it on evolutionary history. The last question, though, I think we can get a much better handle on, and that's adaptive value of song learning. So why do we go through this whole process? And part of what I think that when you start approaching an adaptive value question, one thing I always like to do is to use a cost-benefit approach. And I think something like song learning, you can immediately, I think, start to think of some benefits for it. But I think we also need to think about what are some of the costs of song learning. So why wouldn't everybody want to learn songs? So what are some of the negatives that we could do? So that's what I'd like to start with, is just maybe we can get a list of like different costs that be involved in song learning. You're already there, I see you. So yeah, okay. So I mean that might be producing song at all, but that is a problem. I lost all my markers already. Oh, no, my good ones. What do I do with them? This room's too big. I'm losing things already. Okay. Can you guys see that from there? Okay. So costs. I should write big in this room also. So predator. Detection. That's, despite what it looks, that's an E. What are other costs to song learning? You know, you have to go through all this effort. Okay, you and then I'll go back. Yeah.
It just takes up air.
What do you mean by that?
So like more energy needs to be put into breathing.
Yeah. So the song production. Song production certainly is going to require energy, and it actually requires a lot of energy. This is something I don't think I really gripped very well the first time I was thinking about song as some sort of a trait that might be used in social contexts. But actually, you know, if you look at birds that are in really poor condition, as actually I'll show you a little bit, they have a really hard time producing song. A lot of songs birds have to produce at this really high tempo, or they have to produce them extremely loudly. And it actually takes a lot of energy, literally in sort of caloric value, in order to produce song. I think we could extend this to, I want to get back to try to focus on learning, but I think we could also think about, what do you think, do you think there's energetic costs for the learning process and being able to learn, going through this process of learning song and then producing song that is a learned song? What could be energy costs that go with that specifically? Yeah, okay, so there's definitely a time cost, right? So we talked about, for example, here it is. So these white crowns, it takes them a while to start singing, and maybe that's the way a lot of birds are, even if you're not learning to sing. But there's sort of this extended period of time where there is this window where they have to learn a song, and this is the only time they really can learn a song, is between days 10 and 50. And then some time goes by, and then they have to spend all this time, it's like 50 days, trying to figure out how to produce that song once they start vocalizing. And it takes them practice, and they seem to be comparing what they're hearing versus what's stored away in their memories. And so it takes them like 50 days to actually have a nice, fully developed, mature song. I mean, that's a substantial time cost, I think. At least it seems like it could be a time cost. What else comes to mind as costs? Yeah. that's kind of an issue, right? Like they do have the ability to kind of preferentially hear their own song versus others and tune into that, but man, I mean, still it does happen. And you do have cases where birds will cue in on the wrong song, and then, what do you do? Like, you're an adult and you're producing the wrong species song. You're kind of screwed if you're trying to attract a mate. It's not going to work. So there's the potential for mistakes. I think substantial potential for mistakes. Or maybe there's, in the case of the white crowns, we talked about there being different dialects. Maybe the one you're listening to is like not a very good male, and he's got a crappy dialect that the girls don't like or something. And then you learn the wrong song again. It's the right species, but still you're not cueing in on the best thing. So that kind of thing could definitely be happening. What else could be happening, or what else costly? What else could be costly about songs and song learning? Other ideas? I'm going to throw one in here. I'm going to put energy and resource cost. So in addition to the song production, there's all the song learning, like brain power machinery. You have to produce all this brain tissue, for this L-man region and this area X and all these other regions that are shown here. Some of these, like on this end, tend to be more song production, but these things up here, these are all like song learning areas of the brain. And you probably just wouldn't have to make them if you weren't going to bother with song learning. And that maybe doesn't seem like much, but brain tissue, as it turns out, is extremely costly. So the metabolic rate for like a little square cube would be the right word, of brain tissue is something like 10 times the metabolic rate of of the average tissue. So brain tissue is really expensive to operate. You have to be constantly running those little sodium potassium pumps. There are other costs that also are involved. So it has a high energetic cost. So if you can save on that, if you can cut out some of those energetic costs by not building certain parts of your brain, you can then devote those resources elsewhere. Maybe you can make more eggs, for example, instead of dedicating all your energy to making this big old brain. So these are other potential costs, I think, that we have to be thinking about. So there probably are costs to going through this process of song learning. There's energetic costs, time costs. I like this idea of also just like the mistake cost if you're learning. Whereas if you just have like a genetically canalized song where you get this gene, the genes tell your your vocal system and your brain how to produce a song, and you just do it. And you don't have to practice it necessarily. You certainly don't have to learn the thing. You're not going to be making the kinds of mistakes that potentially could happen if you are learning songs. So if that's true, if there are these substantial costs to song learning, then the question might be, what might be the benefits of this song learning? So I have kind of a list that I threw up here. These are just sort of things I was thinking about ahead of time, and maybe you flip forward and saw some of these things, but I think they mostly replicate what we just talked about. So you have energy and resources to build song structures. You have potential for mismatches and mistakes. What if you learn the wrong song? There's a time cost. It takes time to crystallize the song. So all these things are costs. So there must be benefits. Your book runs through a whole bunch of different explanations, but to me they really kind of fall into three main categories. There are one category of benefits that include habitat-specific vocalizations and benefits that might be associated with that. There's another one, another group that I think are involved or related to improved communication within your local population. And then maybe even call this one a subcategory, but within that then, you also then have female preferences. So females may prefer individuals that can learn particular kinds of songs or songs that are of high quality. So if males can learn song, if that is an indication that they're of high quality, females may prefer those individuals. And so what I want to do basically for the rest of the lecture is run through each of these in turn and show some examples. Most of this stuff comes straight from the book. That tends to be how I roll. So that first hypothesis, the first explanation of a benefit to song learning is that learning may allow habitat-specific vocalizations. And so the arguments here, here's one example of a case where that may be. Different habitats have different acoustic properties. So if you're in a habitat that's really open, versus if you're in a habitat with lots of vegetation in it, those will tend to absorb different kinds of sounds in different ways. So for example, if you're in a dense forest where there's lots of vegetation, lots of trunks and everything, leaves about, maybe there's even sort of understory and lower forest, underforest growth, high frequency sounds tend to attenuate really quickly. They just don't travel very far. They get absorbed by the vegetation in the area, and so you just don't hear that song for much of a distance if you're in a dense forest. However, there are some advantages to high frequencies if at least you're not in that dense forest where those high frequencies can travel a bit, and that is that high frequencies are much more difficult to localize. So from this issue of predator detection, if you use a high frequency song, it's harder for predators to sort of figure out where that's coming from. I think the reason is high frequency songs, the wave fronts between each individual wave are sort of more tightly packed. And as a result, there's less of a difference between one ear and the other ear, and so it's just harder to figure out which way that high frequency sound came from. Low frequency sounds, on the other hand, are easier to localize, but they don't attenuate as quickly. So you get this dichotomy where you would make a prediction then that birds and frankly other animals too would be more likely to use low frequency dialects if you're in a forest, because otherwise your call doesn't go anywhere and nobody hears it. But you would probably be more likely to use high frequency dialects if you're in like an open grassland where there's much less vegetation to absorb those sounds. So if you're in open woodland or a prairie, grassland, these kinds of environments, you might use high frequency sounds because you don't have to worry about attenuation, but you might have to worry about predation. And so it would help you avoid predators. There are numerous examples where this apparently is true amongst birds that do learn song. So this is a great tit. This is a really common passerine songbird that's very common in Europe anyway. They're pretty closely related to chickadees and the tufted titmice around here. I don't know, you can kind of see it if you look at their bill anyway. It's the same sort of tufted titmouse bill. But here are these spectrograms that are depicting the songs of different populations of great tits from different areas. So here's England, Norway, Sweden, Spain, Iran, and Morocco. And what they've done here is they've broken those into different types of habitats. So you characterize the habitat quantitatively or whatnot, and then you classify it into either open or dense forest. And the dense forest individuals, what you can kind of see is they tend to have mostly just these whistle calls that they're using. And if you look at the frequency, it's right around 4 kilohertz in each of these cases. Whereas if you go to the open woodlands environments, like in Spain, they do use some of those 4 kilohertz sounds, but they also use much higher frequencies as well as part of their calls. And this is consistent with this idea that these higher frequency calls are good to use when you're in an open environment because you don't have to worry about them attenuating, but they are harder to localize, and so you won't have predators keying in on your location or your nest location as easily. And the cool thing is, this is all the same species, right? And I mean, you can just look at the spectrograms. You can imagine these sound really different from each other. It's all the same species, and this is a species that learns local dialects. So this is a song learning effect that we're seeing here, as opposed to some kind of like a genetic population difference. So that's one example where we see this habitat-specific difference and a way that song learning seems to allow you to kind of adopt songs that work well in your habitat. Here's another. These are song sparrows. We have song sparrows around here. They're pretty common. They're a reasonably large sparrow, and they've got a big black dot beneath their chin, and they also tend to be just really, really good vocalizers. And they are masters of song learning, at least for songbirds. They're not a parrot, but they're getting up there in that they learn lots of different songs that have similar properties, but they each are a little bit different. And each individual may learn upwards of 8-10 different songs that it can produce. And the cool thing is that they actually use these in what turn out to be kind of like little sparring matches, but they're like vocal sparring matches between males. So you get, here's a little song sparrow male, and this is like a little depiction of what they will tend to do. So imagine you're a male and you're trying to defend your territory, and there's some other male that's over there, and that other male makes a song, or produces a song. You have different choices about what you can do. you can respond aggressively to that individual, you can be kind of neutral, or you can be submissive to that individual. And these other individuals, you know, you probably know who that individual is because they're all kind of interacting with each other over extended periods of time, over weeks at a time. So you have a feel for what songs that individual sings, and then you also have a feel for what you sing. And some birds will overlap in some of the songs that they can sing, whereas, but they may have other songs that do not overlap in terms of the repertoires of one male versus another. So what they will tend to do, if you watch these song sparrows and record what they're doing, if you're looking at a focal bird and that focal bird sings a shared song, so that means that it sings a song that another bird also has in its repertoire, then what they can do is they can choose to either sing the exact same song back, or they could sing another song that they have in common with that male, or they could sing an unshared song. And what they're trying to depict over here are different song repertoires of two different males. So this is this male BGMG, and this is another one that they named MBGB. It's some coding system. But what you can see is that each of them has 6 songs in the repertoire, but 3 of them are shared. So they both can sing song A, song B, and song C. But BGMG sings song D, F, and H, whereas MBGB does not sing those 3, but it can sing E, G, and I, and these are songs that this guy can't sing. So they have a selection of shared songs and unshared songs. Okay, so back to our scenario. So the other male sings a song that is within your repertoire. If you want to respond aggressively back to him, what you would do is sing that exact same song right back at him, and that will escalate the tension, right? It's kind of like escalating the situation. If you're in a little, you got people, somebody, you could sort of put the parallel of you're in a bar and somebody decides they want a bar fight, so somebody starts strutting around and the other person starts strutting back at this point, right? So that's what they're doing here, is they're singing the same song. They're like, no, you didn't. And so then they can sing the other song. If they sing that same song back and forth, that usually is ultimately going to climax in some kind of big aggressive encounter between the two individuals. A little bit more neutral, though, is that you could sing a repertoire match. And if you sing a repertoire match, you're kind of holding your ground, but you're not escalating the situation. Okay, so this would be a situation where BGMG sings song A, MBGB, instead of singing song A back, maybe sing song B. And then you can kind of go from there and see what happens after that. Or you can try to de-escalate or maybe even be a little bit submissive, in which case, instead of singing the exact same song back, you sing an unshared song back. So BGMG sings song A, maybe MBGB sings song G, which BGMG cannot sing. And so you get these little sparring matches. I mean, literally what they do is they put microphones all around the forest. They get this little microphone array, and then they can observe these little sparring matches, and then also do behavioral observations to see, which birds stick around. If some birds are ousted from territory, a lot of times what you'll see is right before that happened, there was a lot of sparring that was occurring where they're singing the same songs back at each other. And certainly it's also another reason why, so these are all learned songs. So if you want to be able to compete and show dominance within a particular habitat, you need to have a repertoire that's going to allow you to match the songs of those individuals around you if you choose to go that route. And so it is important that they have the ability to match songs, so they have to learn these songs that are common within their local environment. Okay? So a little bit of like a sexual selection argument here. It's male-male competition, but it's also about you need to have songs. The argument for this example is you need to have a set of songs that you can use to communicate with the individuals that are in your particular environment. So here you've got to have some matched up songs, otherwise you can't show that sort of dominant behavior. I always love that example. Another case where you need, within a local population, to be able to have good sharing of information is when you have cooperative breeding. And so you need to have common dialects or effectively a language that you can use to share information. So the idea here is in cooperative breeding species, cooperative breeding means you don't just have a mother and a father that are caring for nestlings, but oftentimes you'll have helpers. A lot of times those helpers would be former, not former daughters, sons, but, some daughters and sons from a prior clutch. Sometimes they're completely unrelated, though, and that's a really interesting question for why they would do that. But in these situations, you have these environments where you've got multiple individuals talking to each other. And in so doing, they're sharing information about, there might be a food location call, or there might be a predator alert call, and they need to have calls that work in that particular environment for them. If you look at the size of the repertoires of the number of songs that they learn, that's what they're trying to do in this figure, and it looks kind of confusing, but basically this is like a big phylogeny, and they've kind of twisted it around in a circle because it's cool. I think that's the main, maybe it saves some space. It does look neat. But the idea is that, let's see, how does this work? I think this is the ancestral lineage that's sort of coming in here. I don't know if that's quite right, though. Maybe I guess that's the common ancestor. What I said was just wrong there. So that would be the common ancestor of all these different species. Each of these little spokes is an individual species. And so this is a comparison of, 200 different birds probably. But what they're doing is they're comparing repertoire size, which is the inner ring. So how dark you are, how dark this inner ring is an indication of how many different songs you're able to sing. And they're comparing that to whether or not you're a cooperative breeder, which is shown up in red. So cooperative breeders are red, white individuals are more just like classic mother-father caring for the nest. And it's kind of hard to just stare at the phylogeny, at least in my view, but if you stare at it long enough, I think what you end up seeing is, if I convince myself of this, is that where you have this big band of cooperative breeders, so lots of red individuals, you also tend to have larger, darker dialects. Whereas over here, in these areas where there's not very many cooperative breeders, there are fewer large dialect groups, I think. That's just staring at the phylogeny. You can just take averages, though, and that's where this graph comes in handy. So if they just take the average of repertoire size and compare it for cooperative versus non-cooperative breeders, they do find that the cooperative breeders have larger repertoires than the non-cooperative breeders. So this is really nice evidence that having a large repertoire tends to be associated with these sort of social settings where you need to have the ability to communicate with other individuals. And by having numerous songs that you're learning, or numerous calls that you're learning within your environment, you can take advantage of that communication system and talk to other individuals in your local environment. Basically, it just means that you need to speak the language of the people around you, right? Does that make sense? I get caught up on that one. I love the phylogeny. I think it looks awesome, but I also don't get that much information from it. It looks cool. I like the bar graph better. Okay, so that's two hypotheses. The first one was habitat-specific calls that match the acoustic properties of your habitat. The second one is kind of related. It'd be sort of local population-specific calls, so you can talk to the other individuals around you in a meaningful way. The third explanation for why you'd want to learn song is that females just prefer that you do. And so again, this is kind of a female choice-centric kind of a perspective. But in most cases, in most species of birds, it's males that advertise to females, and males usually are using their calls more than females as a result. So the argument here is that in those species, perhaps the reason that birds learn song, as opposed to just have a sort of genetically canalized song, is that they doing so allows the birds to communicate better, and the females prefer that. So you do certainly see indications that males are singing apparently as a way to attract females. So this is a nice little experiment with these little Cassins finches, where they just basically monitored how much the males are singing on a given day. And what they find is that if they're kind of cruising along on a typical day, males were relatively passive. They'd sing now and then, but they weren't singing an incredible amount of time. But then if you just if you net their female and make her disappear after this male had already formed a pair bond with a female, he sings a lot, right? I mean, it's kind of like, hey, where'd you go, kind of a thing. I don't know what he's thinking, and maybe he's not thinking much at all. But at that point, they really turn on their song production machinery, and so either they're trying to find that mate that they lost, or they're trying to attract another one. But whatever's going on, they're producing quite a bit more song after you remove a female from them. You can kind of do the experiment in reverse, where if you have individuals that haven't really formed a pair, and then the male is just sort of by himself, and you study him, he will be singing reasonably often. This is not like the guy that just lost his girl, but he's still singing with some frequency. But then once you add a female to his cage, he stops singing, or at least dramatically reduces his singing. So this is an indication that, pretty good indication that the song is used for attraction of mates in this particular species. But then the question might be, well, why would they do that? So why are females interested in the songs that males are producing? And so the argument there would be, if females are showing a preference for learned songs, local songs, then they should benefit from this. There should be some sort of tangible benefit that we should be able to prescribe to these females for that preference. And here's one reason why you might like to prefer a local dialect. So this is what do they do here? So here what they were doing is just comparing individual males in white-crowned sparrow populations that sang local dialects versus those that sang more of a distant dialect. So the distant dialect individuals are individuals that apparently have recently immigrated into the area, and they're singing kind of like the wrong song. So they've got the foreign accent, whereas then they're comparing those to males. And what they found is, I know the bars look different, but there's a lot of variation around these. There wasn't any difference in body size between these individuals. But what they did in this study is they actually looked at the number of blood parasites. I don't know what this thing is. I don't know what that is. I think it might, if I remember right, it might be like a fluke of some kind. But in any case, they're looking at a blood parasite that's present in these birds. And what they find is that the non-local males that are singing the foreign dialect tended to have higher rates of this particular blood parasite than did local males, at least within their population. So maybe your local males are less likely to be contaminated with sort of foreign exotic diseases, and therefore it might be better to favor those local individuals. So that's one argument that, and they've done subsequent tests, and there's at least in some species, there are some populations, there's clear indications that females do prefer those local dialects, although interestingly enough, not all. There's another argument, and that's that your song repertoire may be an indication of the health of an individual. And so this is not so much comparing like foreign versus local males. This is more amongst the males that are around you. Which ones are of the best quality? And it could be that the ability to learn song might be indicative of the quality of an individual. And this, to me, this is one of the cooler studies. This is really what convinced me that song learning and song production has a substantial cost. So in this experiment, what they did is they compared food. They had normal males, and then they also had a group of males that, as nestlings, had been food restricted. So they got something like 70% of the calories that the other individuals would have received. So these poor experimental males had been food deprived. And what you see is that some of their song production machinery in their brain, like this H3C, the higher vocal center volume, which is sort of up in the top part of their brain, seem to control both production and song learning, or at least be involved in both. Control individuals that had the full diet had a larger HVC volume than did experimental individuals. So this is certainly indicative that there was a cost, at least in terms of brain power, for the individuals that received the food restriction. And interestingly enough, that seemed to manifest in the songs they produced as well. So initially what they did is they just kind of had, I think they did this with the human observers. So this is kind of hard to do, but basically what you do is you record what's the tutor song. So what is the song supposed to sound like? And then you take the song that actually is being produced by the individual and you kind of score with a sonogram how similar is it to the original. So you're kind of it's an indication of how well are you copying that particular song. And those individuals that were on the control diet had a very nice song copy quality score. Again, this is by human observers, but I'll show you some other stuff in a little bit. It seems to match how the females behave too. Whereas the experimental birds had a lower song quality score. So they're not producing songs that were quite comparable. And here's what this might look like. So here would be an example of a control song. You can, just gives you sort of a feel for what the thing maybe normally should look like. Here's the food restricted songs. And you can see they don't seem to be able to maintain the same cadence, at least not as well and not as clearly. They tend to be more prone to harmonics and less of these sort of big white noise bursts. There's just less darkness in here, so they're not able to produce as much or as loud of song as well. So there seems to be a substantial effect. If you were food restricted as a nestling, you A, didn't grow to have as much of an HVC volume, and B, you just can't produce songs like the individuals can that didn't have that food restriction. If food restriction is at all an indication of your health, which it probably is, your ability to be a good active parent because you're vigorous and lively, which it probably is, then that would indicate, certainly indicate a benefit to females for preferring individuals that can produce the full song as opposed and avoiding the individuals that can't produce that full song, because these guys are probably a little bit more sickly and can't be as good of a helper, or maybe don't have genes that match the environment as well in a normal sort of setting. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, so all of that is just arguing, should they have a preference? So the question is, do they have a preference? Do they actually, do females actually choose based on song quality? And there are a lot of studies that actually show, in fact, they do. So this is one example of them. So in this case, they looked at, they had a taped tutor song. So this is a case where they're rearing these males. As nestlings, they play this song to them, and the males have the opportunity to learn this song. And some of them produce a really good copy of it. So this one, I mean, there's 3 bursts here, there's 4 over here, but it's a good copy of it. It has most of the same qualities of it. This individual over here, they got a different tape tutor song. That's just sort of the way the experiment went. But you can see they didn't copy it nearly as well. I mean, there's missing syllables. This whole like buzz part is kind of not fully developed over here. So you can do sort of just a scoring of the quality of the copy of the song. But then when they play these, or they actually present these males to females, and then they measure the females and see whether or not they're likely to respond in a way that is inviting to the male, what you end up seeing is that the females that hear the good copy songs that came from high quality males tended to produce far more of these more sort of receptivity displays. Literally what they do is just kind of stick their bum up in the air, but that's whereas the poor copy individuals, the females, when they were hearing these calls, didn't tend to perform that display nearly as often. They just seemed kind of indifferent and passive for them. So this is one of many studies that was indicating that these that females do in fact seem to prefer these complex songs that males have to learn. It's kind of fun. I think you actually have to kind of hop these females up on hormones to do this. So you kind of hormonally prime them to get them like really interested in males in general. And then just by hearing the sound, they will do this behavior if it's a good copy of the song. But again, you've got this pretty substantial dichotomy where the poor copies just don't do it for them. Okay, so to kind of sum all this stuff up, this whole chapter, this whole lecture going back to Tuesday, what it's tried to do is look at this issue of song learning at these 4 different levels of analysis that we talked about in chapter 1. So we talked about genetic developmental mechanisms, where birds learn songs during this critical sensitive period. We have these Zenk genes that get upregulated during that time. We talked a little bit about that. That shows up in the homework as well. We also talked about neurohormonal mechanisms where the HVC nuclei interact with, there's this L-man structure and X centers during song learning that drives the arcopalium, this RA thing, to send signals to this thing, which generates motor signals. So there's all these different brain centers that are involved in the neural pathway. We talked about evolutionary history, that song learning probably evolved more than once. But with some parallel mechanisms. They all use the same Zenk gene. Similar brain regions get co-opted in order to produce these songs. And then we talked about all these mechanisms of adaptive value where song learning allows for songs that are a good fit for their environment, both the abiotic and biotic environment. So this means abiotic means, you know, the natural environment, non-living environment, I guess you would say, whereas the biotic environment is strictly talking about the organisms living in the environment. And it provides information on singer quality, which may be used in female mate choice, or male-male aggressive encounters and other kinds of things as well. So we have all these different explanations for birdsong. None of these are mutually exclusive either, right? So these are all compatible. They're all sort of addressing the issue of why do birds learn to sing different kinds of dialects, but they're trying to get at different levels. All right, so that kind of wraps up what I want to do with homework. I went longer than I wanted to, but we still have some time. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to have you guys break up into groups. You can kind of form your own groups, but at least be with 2 or 3 other people. And then talk out your homework questions. I'll assign questions momentarily. We should be able to start talking about them today.